It started with a phone call, a single moment that reshaped the fate of an entire continent. 3 years of war, countless lives lost, billions spent in aid, and now Europe stands at a crossroads. What happens if Russia isn't stopped? What happens if Ukraine falls? What if Europe is left to defend itself without the United States? The stakes have never been higher. As the world watches, European leaders rush to Paris for an emergency summit. Their mission? To finally take control of their own security, and to decide whether peace in Ukraine is possible, or if war with Russia is inevitable. Paris is hosting an emergency gathering of European leaders ahead of talks between the US and Russia about ending the war in Ukraine. Stand by Ukraine, because if we do not achieve a lasting peace, then the economic instability and threats to our security will persist. How to end the war in Ukraine and prevent Russian aggression? That's what we've all been wondering. And that's where we are now, after 3 dramatic and difficult years. What started with a minute phone call between US President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin has thrown Europe into a whole new set of concerns. Neither Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky nor Europe had been involved in the negotiations on peace in Ukraine and how to end the war. Trump's move made European governments suddenly feel excluded. During the 3-year war in Ukraine, Europe had been engaged in an existential struggle against Russian aggression, using all its resources. Billions of dollars in military, economic, and humanitarian aid were given to Ukraine. Many promises were made, including military measures against Russia. Even Sweden and Finland, neutral for years, joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But despite all these efforts and measures, Europe and Ukraine were not on the table. Even Europe's security was a big question mark. Europe now had to think of a security order against Russia, perhaps without the United States. Permanent solutions had to be devised that would not allow Russian threats to approach European borders. Over the years, it has already been proven that this is not a luxury or a show of force, but a necessity. Ukraine is now seen as ground zero for European security and the removal of Russian threats. Therefore, the UK and the European Union came together and reacted strongly. The main objective of the options on the table is to erase or prevent Russian threats completely, to create a lasting order in Europe, and to increase measures at the Russian borders. This required nuclear deterrence and a variety of actions at air, land, and sea borders. When the leaders of the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, the NATO Secretary General, and the presidents of the European Commission and the European Council met in the French capital, one of the main topics discussed was the potential composition and role of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. The options on the table to deflect Russian threats were extending sanctions against Russia, increasing nuclear deterrence against Russia, deployment of peacekeepers in Ukraine, establishment of an air policing unit in Ukraine, and all NATO members to increase military production. At the moment, the UK and the EU have implemented the TIAT extended sanctions package against Russia on the 3rd anniversary of the war. But this is not a move that will deter Russia. We have already seen this many times. So the UK and the EU took action and started working on air policing and peacekeeping in Ukraine. The Royal Air Force could contribute to an air policing mission with the Eurofighter Typhoon on alert for any settlement violations. But can the EU protect itself from Russia by sending troops to Kyiv, or establishing an air policing unit in Ukraine? Could a UK-led peacekeeping force be established in Ukraine? We will now explore which of these 2 options the EU is considering and what actions it is taking to protect Ukraine and limit Russia's invasion efforts. But first of all, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay informed. The first option Europe considered to protect Ukraine was to send troops. This option was strongly voiced by the United Kingdom and France. In this context, it was suggested that the United Kingdom could provide troops. The latest statistics show that the British Army has only regular personnel. Given current commitments and preparations, it would be difficult for the UK to produce a force much larger than a single brigade of 2,000 men, but these challenges were not stopping the UK. The UK signaled the establishment of an air police in Ukraine. The aim of this air policing was to keep Russian fighter jets, missiles, drones, and bombs out of Ukraine. But can this move by the UK keep Russian threats at bay? The UK is reportedly preparing to send RAF Typhoon fighter jets to support a future air policing mission over Ukraine. The apparent proposal comes just a day after the leaders of several European countries met to discuss whether to send troops to support any deal to end the Ukrainian war. UK officials think an air police mission to Ukraine would make sense, but they warn that it would require large numbers of aircraft and ground-based air defense systems to protect jets on the ground. In such a scenario, the aircraft would be used to patrol the line of control, whether from the RAF, other NATO, or other friendly countries. There are logistical questions that will have to be addressed later, but it is already unthinkable for the RAF alone to carry out an air policing mission for Ukraine. Policing such a large area would require an operation of a magnitude greater than anything the RAF has attempted in recent history, and would certainly only be attempted as part of a wider coalition. According to Military Balance, an annual assessment of the size of militaries around the world, the RAF has combat aircraft including fighter or ground attack aircraft, FB Lightning aircraft, and Typhoons. But several dozen Typhoons are expected to be cut. About 50% of Typhoons are thought to be ready to fly at any given time. According to an RAF source, not all of those ready to fly will be suitable for combat operations. Defense analyst Francis Tour said the RAF could deploy around 50 aircraft to Ukraine if pilots and spare parts were available. Experts believe that setting up a single combat air patrol of 2 aircraft would be minimal. Just keeping these 2 jets in orbit for 24 hours would require almost a squadron's worth of aircraft and crews to be sustainable in the long term. Because, you can fly 2 planes every few hours. In the worst-case scenario, if they tried to do it on their own, it might require deploying the entire assets of the Royal Air Force in Ukraine. Air experts think that in the best-case scenario, the air policing operation could be salvaged with 1 or 2 squadrons, a few airborne radar aircraft, and a few tankers. But that this would be weak, and if Russia were to test it, it would quickly become inadequate. To fill the fighter jet gap, apart from the RAF Typhoons, the F-16s, and more recently the Mirage 2000s sent to Ukraine could also be considered. These jet types are already more capable of being integrated into a Western-style air defense system, which could give Ukraine the ability to connect to a wider network and make it more capable as a peacetime policing air force. If the situation with Russia becomes even more hostile, the scenario would look completely different. If the RAF's air policing force, intended to be made up of F-16s and Mirage jets, were to face a fleet of Russian fighter jets just miles away, however, even providing a ground alert type operation in a relatively stable environment would require a lot of assets and expenditure. These assets would probably have to be in Ukraine and could fly 3 or 4 combat air patrols up and down the border 200 miles apart. In addition, ground alerts would allow day and night flights to maintain air presence. Airborne early warning would indeed be a critical asset for this kind of mission, especially from a relatively high altitude very close to the border, providing the ability to see much further into Russian airspace. This system will allow very early detection of incoming aircraft. As part of this whole protection mission, the tasks of the planned air policing will be to prevent Russian aircraft from approaching within a certain distance, whatever that distance may be. In addition to monitoring the airspace for aircraft that go beyond the line of control, the air policing mission will most likely involve the tracking of forces on the ground. This raises the question of how close Ukrainian and Russian ground forces will be allowed to get to the borderline. Whatever the rules, this is probably the easiest thing to monitor from the air or from space. It now seems increasingly likely that a stronger air police contingent will be seen as a way to compensate for the smaller contingent presence that would otherwise be insufficient to monitor and patrol what Ukraine's future land border with Russian-controlled territory will look like. Regardless of where the border will be redrawn, and to what extent Ukraine will reclaim some of its sovereign territory, this new line of air control will create a serious sense of unease for Russia. Russian fighter jets could be blocked by the UK's proposed air policing of Ukraine. An air policing mission is primarily a peacetime endeavor, providing surveillance as well. Could be salvaged with 1 or 2 squadrons, a few airborne radar aircraft, and a few tankers, but that this would be weak. And if Russia were to test it, it would quickly become inadequate to fill the fighter jet gap. Apart from the RAF Typhoons, the F-16S, and more recently, the Mirage 2000 sent to Ukraine could also be considered. These jet types are already more capable of being integrated into a Western-style air defense system, which could give Ukraine the ability to connect to a wider network and make it more capable as a peacetime policing air force. If the situation with Russia becomes even more hostile, The scenario would look completely different if the RAF's air policing force, intended to be made up of F-16 and Mirage jets, were to face a fleet of fighter jets just 50 miles away. However, even providing a ground alert type operation in a relatively stable environment would require a lot of assets and expenditure. These assets would probably have to be in Ukraine and could fly 3 or 4 combat air patrols up and down the border 50 miles apart. In addition, ground alerts would allow day and night flights to maintain air presence. Airborne early warning would indeed be a critical asset for this kind of mission, especially from a relatively high altitude very close to the border, providing the ability to see much further into Russian airspace. This system will allow very early detection of incoming aircraft. As part of this whole protection mission, the tasks of the planned air policing will be to prevent Russian aircraft from approaching within a certain distance, whatever that distance may be. In addition to monitoring the airspace for aircraft that go beyond the line of control, the air policing mission will most likely involve the tracking of forces on the ground. This raises the question of how close Ukrainian and Russian ground forces will be allowed to get to the borderline. Whatever the rules, this is probably the easiest thing to monitor from the air or from space. It now seems increasingly likely that a stronger air police contingent will be seen as a way to compensate for the smaller contingent presence that would otherwise be insufficient to monitor and patrol what Ukraine's future land border with Russian-controlled territory will look like. Regardless of where the border will be redrawn and to what extent Ukraine will reclaim some of its sovereign territory, this new line of air control will create a serious sense of unease for Russia. Russian fighter jets could be blocked by the UK's proposed air policing of Ukraine. An air policing mission is primarily a peacetime endeavor, providing surveillance as well. As fighter aircraft that can quickly respond to potential airspace violations and other contingencies. Of course, the nature of the air policing response will then depend on a number of operational considerations. But if it is determined to be engaged in hostile action, this could extend to seizing the aircraft. All this would depend on the nature of the potential ceasefire agreement. At this point, we are still in the very early stages of such an agreement taking shape. But the UK wing is continuing its efforts to urgently establish an air police in Ukraine. It is raising this issue. He spoke to the chairman of the Air and Space Force, retired Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, one of the RAF's most experienced former operational commanders who led combat operations in Libya and Syria and various peacekeeping missions around the world. This meeting is critical for the planning of air policing. Bagwell said that the UK military would almost certainly be doing contingency planning for a possible peacekeeping mission. Bagwell also notes that talk of European countries sending troops to Ukraine or supporting Ukraine after a ceasefire could involve air forces and navies, as well as ground troops. Nevertheless, Bagwell believes that in this case, only the creation of a buffer zone within Ukraine's borders would suffice. At the moment, however, the UK's priority seems to be building air policing in Ukraine. The Eastern European bloc actually supports the establishment of air policing in Ukraine, especially Poland is at the forefront in this regard. There are reports that the deployment of air patrol aircraft in Poland is being considered. As you may recall, in early February, the Polish Armed Forces Operations Command announced that it had activated fighter jets following Russia's bombing attacks on Ukraine. Polish military officials reported that fighter jets had taken off and ground-based air defense and radar reconnaissance systems had reached the highest level of readiness. The Warsaw government carried out a similar operation in the second week of February. On February 10th, Poland sent F-16 fighter jets in response to Russia's large-scale missile and drone attack on Ukrainian territory. This critical new news was confirmed by the Operations Command of the Polish Armed Forces. Poland's military command assured that it is closely monitoring the situation and that its forces and assets are ready to respond immediately in the event of a threat. This means that the Polish wing has the ability to use its fighter jets against Russian aggression, even if there is no air policing in Ukraine at the moment. Poland's aim in deploying its air force against Russian aggression in Ukraine is to secure its own border lines. Warsaw is also a protector of Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. As a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Poland has been a critical ally of Kiev in the ongoing war, providing some $3 billion in military aid as of November. The Warsaw government suggests that such aid will continue, keeping its air force on alert against Russian attacks. Romania is another country that has kept its air force on alert against Russian aggression against Ukraine and the ever-present Russian threat in the Black Sea. Concerns that drones launched in the war between Russia and Ukraine have landed on Romanian territory have increased significantly. Most of the incidents took place in Romania, close to Ukrainian ports on the Danube River, which have been targeted by Moscow. Given the commitment to collective response enshrined in the alliance's charter, the incidents raised concerns that the war in Ukraine could spill over to the rest of Europe. This has made the Romanian Air Force vulnerable to Russia. If you remember, the Romanian wing announced that it had sent F-16 aircraft to the region after Russian drones landed near the NATO border. The Romanian Air Force's fourth-generation aircraft took off after drones approached from Ukrainian airspace near the Romanian border. Two F-16s from Romania's 71st Airbase in Câmpia Turzii took off to observe the situation and returned to the base hours later. Last October, Romania reported that it had to scramble fighter jets for several days in a row after Russian drones violated its airspace for the second time in 2 days. The Romanian Air Force claims that it will continue to monitor its airspace and work with NATO on the risk posed by Russian drones. This assertive stance was renewed by the Bucharest government after the alliance deployed an additional airborne warning and control system aircraft, increasing airspace surveillance over Romania since September. Romania points directly at Russia as the main culprit for keeping its air force on constant alert. Bucharest considers the bombing, drone, and missile attacks by Moscow's air force targeting Ukraine as unjustified. The Romanian Defense Ministry condemns the attacks by Russian drones targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine as unjustified and contrary to international law. For this reason, it is thought that in the future, the Romanian Air Force will be kept on constant alert against Russian fighter jets in the Black Sea. All these ideas put the cart well ahead of the horse. The negotiations have just started. The Ukrainian government is not involved. One of the few things we know is that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that the idea of a peacekeeping force, especially one composed of NATO member states, is completely unacceptable to the Kremlin. There is still a long way to go. President Trump wants a peace agreement between the Western and Eastern Orthodox churches by Easter, which this year falls on the same day, April 16th. The signs are that he is willing to make important concessions to Moscow at the expense of Ukraine. The rehearsals of who can do what to enact an imaginary solution give a strong impression of the displacement activity of European governments. The prospect of a deal between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is turning the agenda upside down. But could the Ukrainian war end in 2023? After years of war, there is essentially a stalemate between Russia and Ukraine, yet Russia is losing more than 500 lives a day. Both sides may decide that it is no longer worth sacrificing so much blood and treasure for minimal territorial gains. Trump's return to the White House is also changing the debate. Of course, the wrong peace deal could embolden Putin to reignite the war somewhere after rearmament or permanently poison Russia's relations with the West. It might even increase the likelihood of war between Russia and NATO, or lead to the overthrow of the Zelensky government in Ukraine and the establishment of a puppet regime dependent on Moscow. Putin could also prolong a negotiation process to buy time and further territorial gains while he fights. President Trump has claimed that he can negotiate a quick end to this terrible war, but to do so, will need more influence on both sides. The new United States and NATO strategy for the war could give Ukraine a last chance to recover the stolen and occupied territories in 2023, but this may not necessarily be the case. Ending the war quickly in a stabilizing and sustainable manner should indeed be a top priority. Ukraine has made some progress in its counteroffensive, but much less in 2022, or it is arming and preparing for another attempt, perhaps with a different approach this time, with a chance of success. But in the coming weeks or after a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive, the United States may prioritize ending the conflict even if Russia retains 20% of pre-war Ukrainian territory. Ukraine could maintain its political claims to Russian-occupied territories but agree not to demand their liberation on the battlefield. Russia can agree to end aggression and recognize that strong international mechanisms will be needed to support Ukraine's long-term security, as no one can rely on it anymore. If Ukraine fails to achieve a major success in a counterattack in early 2023, a different and more limited United States and NATO arms assistance program for Ukraine should be established thereafter, with an emphasis on defensive weapons. This new program should be open-ended because no one can predict when and if Russia will stop its aggression. Likewise, economic support for Kiev from key donors in Europe, North America, and Japan should continue. Harsher economic penalties against Russia would provide an even more significant incentive for Russia to start negotiations to end the war quickly. If the war does not end soon, China should be pressured to reduce its industrial production to Russia. Most importantly, to create pressure and time pressure, Western countries could start giving Ukraine 1/4 to half of Russia's $300 billion in frozen assets each year by 2023. This should continue until a verifiable peace is reached, at which point Moscow would recover its remaining assets. The West would need to announce its willingness to lift most of the other economic sanctions imposed on Russia over time if it accepts and respects genuine peace. As a way to make a deal more attractive to Moscow, and therefore more negotiable and durable, there should be a willingness to consider other avenues besides NATO membership to ensure Ukraine's long-term security. It is possible that most of the contingent would be European. Ideally, some would be American, which would give the mission strength and credibility with Russia. To convince Moscow, this proposal may have a time limit. NATO could announce its intention to offer Ukraine membership if Russia refuses to make a deal within a year of the start of negotiations. Of course, even a more pragmatic United States strategy cannot guarantee an end to the war. Only Russia and Ukraine can make that choice. Realistically, the chances of success in 2023 are probably no more than 50%. Thank you for following us.